I spent 12 hours a day studying, but couldn't beat PL 100. Then a high stakes pro showed me one critical mistake that was holding me back. And within months, I moved up to 1-2, 5-10, and later even to 10-20. Today, I'll show you the mistake that stopped me and stops many players from beating PLO. I'll show you how to actually use solvers to win and give you real examples that will improve your win rate without overwhelming you. What is this critical mistake? Take my situation a few years back. I spent hours making spreadsheets, writing out frequencies, exploring different sizings and noting down every small detail about the game. I was no longer a poker player, I became a statistician. And man, it didn't go well. When I opened tables, all the data would just blur together, situations look similar, and I couldn't recall any of them. And results wise, I wasn't doing well either. I couldn't beat PL 100. And this brings us to the core of the issue. It's one thing to remember the strategy of a hand in one spot on one board, but to do it for every single hand across a variety of situations for a variety of flops, turns and rivers, that's a completely different ballgame. On top of that, while in No Limit Hold'em we are dealing with hundreds of combos, in PLO there are hundreds of thousands or millions in the case of PLO 5. So trying to memorize all the details and solver intricacies is the wrong approach. There's just too much data to process. And for months, that's where I was stuck. Then something happened. I discovered a video from a high stakes pro explaining his approach. And I knew right away this is what I'd been missing. I learned more from that one video than I had from hundreds of hours studying by myself. So what was the critical lesson? You can think of it like this. To get around your hometown, you don't need to memorize every street. You just understand the layout. PLO works the same way. You don't need to memorize every combo in every spot. You need to understand the patterns behind the game, so when a new situation comes up, you still know where you're going. That's when execution becomes easier. So how do you do that? Let me break it down into 3 steps. I call it the SIB method. The first step helps you avoid getting lost in the sea of data. What good is it knowing the solver bets 3 sizes and check raises 2 if you can't do it at the table? Execution is what makes the money. Complexity kills it. The good news is that in most situations we can use simplified strategies without losing much EV, and that's in solver land. In practice, your EV is much higher executing a simplified strategy well than failing to execute a complex one. Step 2, and this goes hand in hand with simplifying. I've never seen a better example of the 80-20 rule than in solver studying. 20% of what's there gives you most of your win rate. The rest is mostly noise, and this is where players get stuck. They spend hours obsessing over tiny EV differences, mixed frequencies, or exotic lines that barely affect their win rate. In reality, most of these spots depend on who is sitting on the other side of the table. If a decision is close, stop obsessing over exact solver frequencies and tiny EV gains. Focus on what actually gives you the edge, population tendencies and reads. Once you simplify and filter out the noise, repeating themes start emerging. And the crucial thing is that these themes are not only useful in one unique situation, but apply across many different spots. This is what supercharges your study sessions. You stop spending time on tiny details that barely move your win rate and start learning the underlying principles that actually guide the game. I first experienced this myself when I transitioned from No Limit to PLO. But later when I started playing 5-card and even 6-card, it became even more obvious. This shift in thinking is one of the main reasons I was able to reach high stakes across all 3 formats within just a few years. Now that you understand the approach, let me show you how it works in practice. The first one is by far the most underrated area in PLO. Even good players still make mistakes here. When you first see the opening frequencies, 15%, 19, 24, 32, 49, 36, they just look like random numbers with no connection. But once you study them, you realize these ranges are actually pretty similar. If you understand what a solid cutoff range looks like, you already have a strong understanding for small blind because the frequencies are very similar. We're just mostly adding a few more marginal hands. And even if you accidentally played your cutoff range from the small blind, you wouldn't be making some massive mistake. As for the button, while the core of the opening range is similar to the cutoff, simply playing a slightly wider cutoff range wouldn't be enough, so instead we use a simple heuristic. When in doubt, open. This gets you very close to a solid button opening range, and you can always fine-tune it later with the trainer. What about early positions? Well, 30% range would be way too loose. Instead, we use the opposite heuristic. When in doubt, fold. If a hand feels marginal, just fold. Over time, that brings your range much closer to where it should be. And you can even use the cutoff range as an anchor elsewhere. The big blind defending range versus the button shares a lot of similarities with the cutoff opening range. So instead of studying every spot separately, you can ask yourself, what would I open from the cutoff here? Then instead of learning a completely new range from scratch, you just figure out which hands needs to be added. So for example, big blind starts defending extra hands like pocket jacks or tens that cutoff is folding. And this brings us to the next big problem. Now look at this example. The solver wants to call 53% of the time and raise 46. So what should you actually do here? Should you mix? I personally think the answer is never. Nobody is exploiting you because you didn't randomize King Queen 7-7 double suited perfectly. You already have other 7-7 hands that are pure 3-bets and pure calls anyways. What usually happens instead is that mixing becomes a shortcut for lazy thinking. Instead of paying attention to population tendencies, reads, stack sizes or game flow, your brain just says, oh, this hand mixes. Now compare that to this next mistake. 3-betting is 20 BB per 100 worse than calling. Now, this is a meaningful mistake. This is the kind of spot I would spend much more time studying. Tiny mistakes rarely change your understanding of a spot, but big mistakes often completely reshape it. This next part changed the way I think about pre-flop. When you examine the cutoff, raise first in range, you quickly notice that the solver loves ace-x hands. Why? The number one thing restricting our opening range is facing a 3-bet. And this has two big implications. First, we want to reduce the 3-bet frequency of our opponents, and we do it by opening hands with an ace. Second, if we do face a 3-bet, we want hands that are not completely dominated and can still navigate well post-flop in low SPRs. That's why the solver folds hands with low or disconnected side cards, such as 3 deuce, 4 deuce, 5 deuce, 7 deuce, and so on. I call these bad hold'em couples. And this pattern is not only true for cutoff raise first in. You'll see it with middle position open, early position, small blind, and even in other situations. For example, ace-x double suited hands mostly 3-bet when they don't contain a bad holding couple, and when they do, cold calling is the preferred option. This is the SIP method in practice. We not only cover multiple areas of the game at the same time, but also build heuristics that helps us actually execute a winning strategy. Unfortunately, once we get to post-flop, the number of situations and variables grows exponentially. So let me show you how to approach post-flop in a way that actually improves your win rate. We play from and against the early positions very early, so spending a lot of time studying these spots won't really affect your win rate as much. On the other hand, the spots we really want to focus on are the ones that either happen constantly or create large pots. These would be button versus big blind, cutoff versus button, or 3-bet pots. This brings us to the next problem where people often get stuck. I told you earlier that I used to spend hours writing down tiny details until I felt more like a statistician. Then I discovered something that changed the way I was studying. Let's take this for example. We can see that cutoff doesn't c-bet a lot in general. You can see 10-8-4, around 16%, Jack 9-6, around 12%, or only 6% on King 8-7. This is all due to the positional disadvantage, and also cutoff has a weaker range than button to begin with. All this with an exception to ace-high boards, where the c-bet is sometimes even 50% or more. And this actually completely changed the way I look at the game. I didn't need to memorize hundreds of flops. Instead, I just need to understand which type of flops actually play differently and why. And once I shifted my focus to these differences, I actually started finally improving and progressing. But what if the strategy is not so clear and obvious? Take small blind versus big blind, for example. This is a spot that many people play the same way as cutoff versus button. But when we actually go through the flops, we can immediately see that small blind c-bet strategy is greatly different from cutoffs. There are boards where small blind c-bet 60, 70 or more than 80% of the time, while the same boards are mostly checked by cutoff. So why is that? While small blind and cutoff ranges are roughly similar, around 30-35%, they are up against very different opponents. You can think of it like coffee. Buttons defending range is like a strong double espresso, smaller in volume but concentrated, while big blind's defending range is like watered down coffee. There is more of it, but it won't give you the same kick. And this is the key difference. Button defends a much tighter range, while big blind defends almost 3 times more hands. That's why small blind gets to bet so much more often, especially on high card boards. But then comes the next problem. How do we actually remember something like small blind c-betting 44.7% on 10-8-4? And how do we do it across all the flops? Of course, we are not able to do it, and it wouldn't have much effect on the win rate either. Instead, if something is between 40 and 60 betting frequency, simply remember it as bet around half of the time. That's just much easier way to play. On the other hand, if something is bet around 30% of the time, just remember it as sometimes bet, or in case of 70% as often bet. And then when you play, you know that sometimes means less than a half of the time, but more than never or rarely. So in this spot, we can say small blind c-bets often on Broadway boards, around half of the time on middling boards, and sometimes or never on low card boards. And that's the entire small blind c-betting strategy in one sentence. Now when you know that, what are the sizes that we should use in PLO? Well, I love using GTO Wizard's feature to test different sizings in seconds. Back in the days, we could usually only run one sizing because solving would take days. So being able to test 5 sizings at the same time in a few seconds is honestly crazy. But every extra sizing creates a level of complexity. It just adds more frequencies, more thresholds. Just the strategy is difficult to understand. Luckily, the reality is that on most flops and turns, we can get away with just one sizing without sacrificing much EV compared to having multiple sizing strategy. So what's the optimal size? What should we use? Well, I think this is where people make it too complicated. We can really divide all flops into 2 groups. The first group is boards where the nuts doesn't change as much by the river. So example of these are paired boards or monotone or straight boards. We call these flops locked, and on locked flops we use small size. It doesn't matter if you are in position or out of position or 50 big blind or 300 big blinds. You simply don't need as much protection with the nuts, so using 1/3 or 1/4 is the way to go. The second type are the regular flops, and when you test multiple sizes, you see that some use 3/4, some use half pot, some use 1/3, but in general, mostly half pot is the preferred size. Now, when you are in position, a lot of people use 3/4, which is totally fine as well. Just understand the trade-off. You cannot bet as frequently with 3/4 as if you use half pot. And now that's it. That's a whole flop sizing strategy. This just frees up so much mental energy, and you can actually focus on other things that really matters. You can derive similar heuristics for turns and rivers, but that's for another video. This last section is where it all comes together, and this was the biggest shift I made on the way to high stakes. You might notice that until now we haven't really talked about combos, and that's for a reason. I'm never going to remember a combo by combo strategy for hundreds of thousand combos. Our best friend is the group panel on the right side. And that's where I spend most of my time. But there is one mistake I made right after switching to this approach that you need to avoid. I went through every flop and wrote down how each group plays and at what frequency. But that's just more of the statistician stuff. Don't do that. You can do this instead. What matters is finding where the strategy changes. Everything else you can ignore. Let's take cutoff against button again, and now facing a bet on this board. We see 2 pair or better, mostly call, not so interesting. Pair, there is fold, there is call, there's also raise, so we need to investigate this. The strategy here changes. Pair and a flash draw, or pair and a wrap, these hand always call. The same goes for pair and open-ended. But what about pair with a gut shot? This is where the mixing starts. It's not real mixing in a sense of indifference. There are just other subgroups with pure strategies, and we need to investigate it. What we actually found here is a threshold group. Anything stronger than a pair with a gut shot, for example, pair and open-ended, always continues. Anything weaker, like bear, pair, almost always folds. And this is the crucial thing that I learned. You don't need to remember anything else about this situation. If you remember the threshold group, it works as an anchor and basically replaces all the memorizing. You know that this is a threshold group, and as you can see, some hands are calling and some folding. So how should you play? Well, simply just call the best hands in that group and fold the worst hands. When we examine what are the best hands, it's pretty clear. It's good over pairs and top pair. When we filter out for these hands, the solver mostly folds. But this is where it gets even more interesting. Let's take a different board, same spot, King, Queen, 8. Try to find the threshold hand. 2 pairs, we see there is a little bit of folding, but mostly the hand group calls. Pairs, we see the same thing. Most of pairs with good draws continue, only a little bit of folding. Pairs with a gutter, again, threshold hand. Some continue, some fold. When we filter for aces, a king with a gut shot, 90% continue. And when we exclude aces and king, most of hands fold. So not only this threshold group that we found apply on previous board, it also apply on other boards. So this concept is universal. Instead of learning every single flop separately, now we have one group that we need to remember. And that's the key to the entire continuing range in this spot. But we can take it one step further. Let's take small blind versus big blind now. Similar situation. The panel says 2 pairs or better. Continue. Pair and open-ended. Always continue. And our threshold group is 50-50. So let's look at good over pairs and a top pair and a gut shot. 96% continue, and gut shots without good over pairs and a top pair, 80% fold. So here you have it. Not only this one threshold hand is universal across various flops, it's also universal across various situations. Of course, there are some small differences, and again, learning these differences is a pretty efficient way how to understand the spot, but already this approach, anchoring just one hand group, gives you the most of the EV, and this is what the entire video is about.